So as Rashida said, I've worked in this field for a very long time, and it's an area of practice I feel particularly passionate about. One of the things that I often say is that while sexual abuse can feel very complex, highly emotional, a little bit scary sometimes, not least for the victims of the crimes, it's also really, really hopeful work, because there are so many things that we can all do to make a massive difference to children and young people's short and long-term outcomes. And that's all of us. That's you as friends, as family members, as parents, as brothers, as sisters, as frontline workers, as senior managers and leadership, as higher education institute providers, social work course providers, funders and commissioners, all of us, and of course the government. All of us have a part to play. And actually some of what we need to do to make a difference is really relatively simple actually, even though it feels kind of complex. Social workers in particular are in a unique position to both prevent child sexual abuse and protect children from it, because we're involved with children right throughout the child's journey. So from universal services, early help, family help, child protection, child in need, care leaver services, fostering and adoption. There are so many places where we have an opportunity to intervene in a way that can be really very helpful to children. We just kind of need to get the knowledge and the confidence and the skills to be able to do that. And we have a fundamental role in overcoming the challenges in practice, which I'm going to talk to you a bit more about in a minute. In order to do these things, as I said, we need to have some knowledge, skills and confidence. And I want to give a particular shout out at this point to Frontline. So at the moment, there is no mandatory requirement for any social work programme to cover child sexual abuse within it. But actually, Frontline kind of some years ago said, you know what, we recognise that we need to be doing this. So most social work students leave university knowing nothing about child sexual abuse. They then go on to, that's one of the big 4 categories that they work with, right? But not the frontline graduates, because for a number of years now, I've had a whole day with frontline students, which doesn't sound like much, but it's really a lot when you think of what we're not doing in other places. So yeah, big shout out to Frontline, and let's hope that others follow in your footsteps, essentially. So first, for those of you who haven't heard of the Centre of Expertise, I'm not going to spend ages on this. We're an organisation set up in 2017, funded mostly by the Home Office, but get funding from Ministry of Justice and some other places as well. And we're a team made up of people with backgrounds in practice, policy and research, and the idea is that we all work together to try and improve the professional response to child sexual abuse. And essentially what we want is children to live free from the threat and harm of child sexual abuse. If you don't know us, please do look us up. I've said a little bit about self-care already, but we know that it can affect people differently at different times. So as I said, please do leave the room if you need to. Be aware of the feelings and experiences of everyone else in the room. You know, it affects a lot of people, so there is highly likely to be people in here who've either experienced it themselves or have a friend or a family member or somebody in their lives that's experienced it. And be kind to yourselves, both personally and professionally. And sometimes what happens is when we're going to be looking at the challenges in practice, and you might be a social worker sitting there thinking, I did that. And actually it's about learning and moving forward, so try not to get preoccupied by things that you might not have done or things that you might have missed. The other thing is that sometimes when you spend focused time looking at a subject like this, it can stay with you. Now, if later on things are popping into your head, and don't worry, that is a normal response to abnormal circumstances, and it will kind of go on from that. And just respect each other's learning journey, so we'll have some time for questions, hopefully at the end. No such thing as a stupid question. With sexual abuse, people get a bit walking on eggshells, worry about saying the wrong thing, and actually that's what we absolutely need to get away from. We need to kind of thrash these things out together. So I'm going to do a bit of context setting around child sexual abuse, then we're going to look at the National Panel Report, and then we're going to think very kind of at the end about the kind of social work role within that, although I'll be talking about that throughout as well. Okay, so some years ago when I was undertaking a file audit on neglect, I came across the case files of Simon. So Simon was a young boy who'd been removed from his family of origin with his younger brother and placed into foster care. Now, when we looked at the case chronology, there were loads and loads of concerns about sexual abuse, inappropriate people moving in and out of the home, concerns around boundaries and privacy, lots of instances of sexualised behaviour, indicators of emotional distress and behavioural kind of issues. And actually each of those incidents, you could see that the professionals around the child were worried about sexual abuse. But every episode concluded with, well, there's nothing we can do because Simon hasn't said anything. Now, some years later, Simon asked to see his files, and the person who was showing him the files kind of, was going it through with him, and he confirmed years and years of sexual abuse at the hands of more than one family member. And she said, well, why didn't you tell anyone? And he very simply said, and why did nobody ask me? And this is the fundamental problem that we have with child sexual abuse, is that we don't talk about it. And actually, the people who abuse children absolutely depend on us to not talk about it in order to carry on abusing children. So it's not just the public that struggle with it, it's professionals. And actually to kind of shy away from it, and we'll look a bit into why some of the reasons behind why we are scared of it, but actually we can really get on top of this if we just start talking about it. And that's what I mean about the complexity. There is an answer to this, which is start talking about it. We just start naming it and, being explicit about it. So essentially what we're held back by is silence. So abuse by its very nature is silencing. And then, we've heard about what silencing did to Simon and will do for many other children all the time. We also have this kind of real lack of knowledge because there is no kind of regular training. There's pre-qualifying training is very poor, post-qualifying training is very poor. So there's a real lack of knowledge, which means that our practice is kind of really governed by myths about child sexual abuse. We're kind of what we learn about child sexual abuse essentially comes from the media, even though we're professionals, And abuse is frightening and scary. So this kind of, obviously, as I said, for the victims, but we are scared of so many things. We're scared of saying the wrong thing. We're scared of, it's probably harder to accuse someone of murder, easier to accuse someone of murder than it is of sexual abuse. We're scared of what the person might say when we ask them. We're scared of opening a can of worms, this kind of phrase that comes up a lot. Now, what survivors say is actually we're living in the can of worms. You asking us a question is not going to make what we've experienced worse if you do that sensitively and well. But we kind of get into this thing of almost putting it on the victim and survivor. So we won't ask them about it because, oh my goodness, what might happen to them if we do? So we kind of think we're being protective, but actually what we're doing is not knowing what to do about that when we should just be asking these questions, There's a real kind of fear of thinking the unthinkable, and obviously we're really busy, and it's hard to think about abuse of any child, but abuse of a kind of very young or vulnerable child is even more difficult, so we worry about that. And probably one of the biggest things we worry about is contaminating evidence. So we are all absolutely consumed with, if we say the wrong thing, will we interrupt a criminal trial? And then will we not get criminal justice for this family? And I'll talk a bit more about this, but this is interesting because actually, on average, around 1 in 10 cases are further actioned by police, 1 in 10. And we are all totally consumed by saying the wrong thing in a case that's probably never going to go to court anyway. Even the ones that go to court, around about half are going to get convicted. So it's kind of a disproportionate fear that we have around saying the wrong thing, and that we really need to change that. What we need to do is move towards this, so kind of good communication, talking to each other. And social workers are quite key in needing to lead this change, I think, and modelling this change amongst all agencies, We need hope and we need courage, and we need to learn everything that we can about this topic so that we're kind of informed when we're talking with people. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you a bit about the scale of child sexual abuse. This is what we know from the data. So more than 1 in 10 children have been sexually abused by the age of 16. We think this is a conservative estimate, much higher for girls than boys. One of the things I always say at this point is whatever reports or data, including the recent Casey review, the Ofsted review into schools, it's always around 75% girls, 25% boys. 25% boys is a lot of boys. 5% of boys is a lot of boys. So we mustn't forget that boys are victims, and there are additional ways in terms of additional issues for them telling people as well. Now, this is the general population. So we need to think about the population that we work with, okay? And how much higher that might be, and we'll look a bit more about that in a minute. The other thing just to understand is about the different contexts of sexual offending. So what we've tended to be, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are all the kind of different contexts where children get sexually abused. And what we've tended to do is being very siloed in our approach. And what that's meant is kind of all of the attention has gone on one form of harm to the exclusion of other forms of harm. And what we actually need to recognise is that these are often the same children, okay? And they're kind of... We got so, with child sexual exploitation, we spoke about it so much as another form of harm that we kind of forgot it was child sexual abuse. We had, and we forgot that actually there might be child sexual abuse in the histories of children who are being sexually exploited. So there was a report done in Wales by Sophie Hallett who looked at like 10 years worth of 100 children's services files. And within that, 50% of children who were sexually exploited had previously experienced sexual abuse in the family environment. Okay. These are often the same children. Yet how often when we're working with sexually exploited children are we asking them what's in their background? So if we're providing them with an intervention programme around understand healthy relationships, or we're going to be missing, the kind of nub of the issue. The Truth Project, so the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, around about half of the victims who were abused in institutions were previously abused within the family home. So these are the same children. And then we think about online child sexual abuse, and we've done something really interesting here, I think. So when you think back to how we thought about sexual abuse, we often thought about stranger danger. So this is things that happen out there by other people. And the media would love us to kind of think about that, really. It's people not like us that do it over there. We've done the same with the online world. So we very much talked about strangers contacting you online. What the research is now saying is the majority of children who are sexually abused online are abused by people they know. And yet we've done this whole be careful who you're friending and, you know, all that kind of stuff. What we also know is around about, like the majority of images that are available online are filmed in familial settings, and around about half, according to surveys, around about half of the production of online imagery comes from family members. So we've also got to remember that these things cross over, and what we're seeing in practice is that we are often, if there's a parent who's been arrested for indecent images of children, for example, we're forgetting to think, actually, we need to just think, now not all of them will be a risk to their own child, but we do need to consider that they might be. So it's a kind of a bit of a call to what we need is to think about all forms of child sexual abuse under the same heading. The most common context of abuse, not to be kind of, you know, you probably wouldn't think this if you were just reading the papers, but the most common context of sexual abuse overall with all children is the family environment. For girls, it's within the family. For boys, it's in institutions, okay? But again, this is the bread and butter of social work, working with families and working with children in institutions. So this is where most of them experience sexual abuse. Now, we did some really interesting data, looking at the data. So the data from the adult crime survey. So question, when you ask an adult what they experienced as children, okay? So children who lived in conditions of neglect were 5 times more likely to experience sexual abuse, okay? 5 times more likely. How many children do we work with on our caseloads where we're saying that these are neglected children? And how often are we thinking this is a big risk factor? Children who spend time in residential care 4 times more likely. Now, we don't know if they're being abused before or after they come into care, but it's certainly something for us to be thinking about. And we saw in the CSA review the kind of numbers of children who are at risk when they're in care from, you know, people who want to exploit them. And disabled children at least twice as likely. They actually come up as higher in lots of other research, but according to the crime survey, at least twice as likely. How many children sitting in disability services are on child protection plans? Or, you know, very few. And then there's other factors that increase the risk. So drugs and alcohol, 3 times more likely. That's the same, I think, for adult mental health. And over half of the children who experience sexual abuse also experience other forms of harm. Now, that's important because, weirdly, even though all harm is awful, we do find it much easier to focus on other harms. So what we see is if there's another concern in there, then we'll throw all our kind of efforts on that and not the sexual abuse. It's estimated that 500,000 children a year experience child sexual abuse just in a year in England and Wales, okay? Now, most of those do not come to the attention of statutory services. So the highest number will come to policing. So we've got 101,000. Now, that's not children, that's offences. So 101,000 offences reported to the police over the last year. Children's social care, so the next rung up is the number of assessments done by children's social care. So that drops to 45,000 assessments done. It's the lowest level in 9 years. It's dropped from 8% from last year. It was one of the other things noted in the CSA review actually about what is happening to these children. And then if we look at the top, now that's been rounded up to 2,200, it's actually 2,160. The number of children on plans for child sexual abuse is at its lowest level ever since record began in 30 years. So there isn't less sexual abuse. This is something we really need to think about. Now, when you look at the crime survey data and compare across, sexual abuse is as likely as physical abuse, a bit less likely than emotional abuse to be reported. But when you look at the assessments done by social care, it kind of comes right down. And this shows you the kind of massive kind of graph in relation to plans for neglect and emotional abuse going up and up and up, and sexual abuse reducing by nearly 2/3. And at its lowest level of all times. Now, as social workers, we really need to think about this, because if we go back to what I'm saying around Simon and the silencing and how much we don't talk about this, if we are not being explicit in the recommendations of child protection plans or in our assessments, then we're silencing it again. We're not going to be responding to that. It's a crude measure, and lots of people will say, well, it's okay because we're putting them on for neglect, or we're putting them on for that, but we know there's sexual abuse, but we're not naming it. And therefore we're not responding to it. So there is something about social workers need to explicitly name things in assessments, even though that feels hard. Arguing strongly for child protection plans. We hear a lot from from social workers that child protection chairs say we haven't really got the evidence, and we're going to think a bit more about that in a second. So, on to the National Panel Report. We were absolutely delighted that the Child Safeguarding Practice Review Panel decided to focus on intrafamilial child sexual abuse, because it's been out of the spotlight for ages. And interestingly, they decided to do that review not because of the numbers, but because of the incredibly poor practice that they were seeing in the cases that came up. This is the question they asked us to kind of look at. So what are the challenges in identification, assessment and response? And what can we do about the multi-agency working locally and nationally? We were commissioned to do this piece of work, which we were also delighted about. And what we did is we analysed 136 of the rapid reviews, so the quick reviews that local authorities do, and 40 of the more in-depth reviews, which covered 193 children who'd been sexually abused in the family. We also looked at all the recent research and practice guidance to see what was out there. We had 10 online reflective discussions with 107 practitioners who were involved in those reviews to ask them kind of what their thinking was. We had 2 interviews with young people. Okay, so we had gone to ethics committee. We'd got agreement to speak to 20 young people, and we could not get to them. We couldn't get past business managers or the social work managers or whoever it was, because they were like, no, don't talk to the child. Now, if we don't, it's very hard, even within academics, within universities, to do any sort of research with children, let alone about sexual abuse with children. But if we don't start hearing their voices, then their voice is going to be absent from this stuff. So we had to kind of search in other places for their voices and other research that had been done. It was very disappointing. The 2 children that did speak to us were just so pleased to be part of a review that was going to make a difference. Because part of healing and recovery is about also helping other people, So that was disappointing. We actually managed to speak to more people who'd harmed in prison, so we spoke to 5 of them than we did children, which is interesting. We also then had kind of a series of roundtables with people in criminal justice, specialists in generalist health, inspectorates, government departments, to kind of really bring it all together. So it's a very thorough kind of piece of work. And this was kind of the overriding finding, essentially, that there is a systemic failure across all services to recognise and respond to child sexual abuse in the family environment. And that's important. The context of that is important because this isn't about individual practice, actually. This is about practitioners working in a system that is really needs some address, essentially. So these are the kind of key themes. I'm going to go give you a bit of kind of information on each of them. So first of all, in terms of not hearing children's voices, so even though we know from research that most children don't tell, in this sample, 75% of the children had told, and some of them had told repeatedly, but they hadn't been listened to. So that was interesting. Now, however, there were also young people who hadn't been able to tell, and one of them gave us the title of the report. So she said, I couldn't talk about the sexual abuse, it was too difficult. I wanted them all to notice and to ask me what was going on. So within this theme, what we saw was practitioners not talking to children about sexual abuse while relying on children to tell them about it in order for them to take action. Okay. We had practitioners in the round table saying, if only they'd told us what was going on, we knew it was happening, but if only they'd actually told us. Well, I can't possibly write that down because we don't really know because they haven't told us, that kind of thinking around stuff. We also saw kind of lack of opportunities for children to talk on their own with professionals. So one of the young women was being abused by her foster father and was always spoken to while she was with her foster mum. How do you report that? How do you say actually, What we saw was retractions were often taken more seriously than the original disclosure. So research indicates that particularly young children, particularly where there's a big response against a child telling, retractions are very high. And what we do is, the child's retracted, so we can just close that case. In fact, it puts them more at risk because actually this is a child then that made that up, rather than seeing a retraction as absolutely what happens in cases of sexual abuse, We saw as well practitioners not giving children information that they needed. So we had one young person who was placed by a judge with her stepfather who had a previous conviction for sexual offending. And nobody told her that this was the situation. So when it came to light, I think she was one of the young people that became pregnant, and it came to light and she found that out. She said, why did someone not tell me that I was living with a convicted sexual offender? Because it might have been an opportunity for me to tell them what was going on. And we have a real fear about talking to children and siblings and all of this stuff, about this stuff, even though they're living in it. Also, children not having access to appropriate support, so not being stable enough to receive therapy, kind of something that you might recognise, so that was a problem. Now, there aren't enough specialist services for children who've experienced sexual abuse. There really aren't, and there's not enough funding in that space. But also, we mustn't underestimate the power of all practitioners knowing what they can and should say to children, in that process. So we can't send all of them to specialist services, actually. We can't. But we can do a lot. There's a lot that we can do to make a real difference to children, all of us, if we just kind of learnt what it was that we needed to say, essentially. So advice from a child on this, and I love it, children's advice is always just really simple and obvious. Just said, ask more direct questions and keep children informed. Just like that. Yeah, that is what we need to do. So this is a quote from a previous piece of research, but there were so many times when I thought about telling someone, but how do you bring it up? How do you just walk into a room and say, oh, by the way, this happened? Could any of us do that? No, we need people to ask us what's going on, to say, are you all right? To follow up, are you sure you're all right? We need help. Sometimes we need people to say, I'm worried this is going on for you. Is it going on for you? That kind of thing. Now, I've kind of popped in some of the resources we have as we go through, but I won't dwell on those unless we have time in the end. But this is a resource we have to support people to have these conversations. Children need help to tell, and we are as fundamental to the disclosure process as the child themselves. All of us, actually, whatever role we're in. Okay, so secondly was around understanding parents and carers context. So what we saw mostly in here was a real lack of understanding of domestic abuse and coercive control and how that impacts a parent's capacity to protect. So within that, we had an unrealistic over-reliance on parents who were often living in violent situations or relationships to be in charge of what was going on or to manage a safety plan and those kind of things. We saw some kind of, as you can imagine, they weren't safety plans, they were written agreements. We had a 7-month pregnant mum being advised to lie across the bedroom door of one of her siblings, one of her children, so the other one didn't go in there. We had a woman who was, married to someone who had sexual convictions. Why he was in the house, I'm not sure, but she was just advised to put a bell on the door so if he got up in the night, she would know about it. There was also domestic abuse in that relationship. So this kind of real lack of understanding. And what we do is we rely on parents heavily to protect their children without explaining to them what the risks are in a way that they can understand. So for example, with families with English as a second language, not properly understanding that, or parents with learning disabilities, we kind of, and yet relying on them, and then they fail to protect, which is not good. So the other thing that we saw really strongly in this was this kind of tendency to disbelieve mostly mothers, particularly within the court arena. So we had quite a number of cases that had been in the family courts in this sample. We had the child that was placed by the judge with a convicted offender, that was one of them. But what you saw is that when the mother said something about, I'm worried about sexual abuse, or my child has told me about sexual abuse, or there was an immediate kind of response, which was, she must be making this up, it's malicious. Actually, what we should do is encourage contact or even move the child to the residence of the other parent. This is something we're separately kind of looking at actually within the centre, because what we've heard is that legal solicitors will actually advise parents not to mention sexual abuse, mothers not to mention sexual abuse, even if they're worried about it, because what will come back is parental alienation syndrome and you may lose your child as a result. So we have parents kind of not mentioning it. So that's something that obviously needs working on as well. And we need to remember, as social workers in the room, that actually, even if there is acrimony in a relationship, that doesn't mean that this isn't true. Actually, what it might mean is that it is true, because there's a context there which makes sexual abuse more likely, but we have this real kind of assumption that mothers make it up, essentially. So what we know from research is the better we support the parent, the better we support the child. So working well with these parents and carers, keeping them informed, not assuming that they knew about abuse when it happened, kind of being respectful, teaching them what's going on, is our best way of empowering families to keep their children and move forward. We're not going to be around forever. Thirdly, so barriers, so this one is really kind of, and this, don't forget the context of this lack of training, a real lack of training. We've had no training on this, on emotionally difficult work, where even managers and supervisors haven't had training either, so it's a difficult one. But what we saw is people just didn't know what the signs and indicators of sexual abuse are, didn't pick up and that was all agencies actually, didn't really pick it up. And where children were disabled, that was particularly problematic. So signs and indicators that disabled children were giving out were being seen as being part of their diagnosed condition. And so we just thought, well, that's good, that's not sexual abuse, we can leave that one there. Interestingly, we also saw children that were diagnosed with conditions where actually it was actually a sign and indicator of sexual abuse, not a condition. So we kind of saw it in both directions, which was interesting. So we didn't only see poor identification of the signs and indicators in children, but also the signs and indicators in the behaviour of the people around the child. So a real lack of understanding of grooming behaviour and all that kind of stuff. And that fed into then a really poor quality risk assessments. So in a third of the cases we looked at, there was known offenders living within the family, or people with very kind of real concerns around sexual abuse that we knew about. So we knew about the concerns of sexual abuse in a third of those cases. So that we had kind of convicted offenders moving in with no risk assessments, police not sharing information that they needed to share, all sorts of kind of issues around that, which was, really problematic. Another big thing which comes up all the time, information sharing, really problematic, and also a lack of kind of good chronologies. Now, you need a good chronology on sexual abuse because you need to plot these signs and indicators over time, so I don't know how many times we can say that that's a massively important thing to do, but it keeps coming up. Now, the children are much more likely to show us rather than tell us what's going on for them. So 82% of males, 76% of females do not tell anyone at the time that they're being sexually abused, and yet our system has this reliance on them needing to tell, so that's not going to work. Now, the Joint Targeted Area Inspection in 2020 on family environment looked at this and said, actually, we're placing an unrealistic expectation on children to identify that they're being abused in the first place, find a trusted adult that they can talk to, and then tell them. And that's what we're basically expecting them to do, and that's not going to protect children. What we need is social workers to recognise the signs and indicators in the children, in the people around the child, and in the contexts that are of risk, which is what that resource does. So the last theme was around issues in responding. Now, the biggest problem within this is around believing that the criminal burden of proof, okay, so beyond reasonable doubt is the criminal burden of proof, believing that that is needed in order to take action with children, even though our legal framework in social care is the balance of probabilities. But all of the practice is kind of governed by the idea that we need this beyond reasonable doubt evidence, and it is unbelievably hard to get beyond reasonable doubt evidence. If you're being abused within the family, so essentially to get that evidence, there'd need to be medical evidence of the harm, very rare. Children don't tell at the time. Loads of sexual abuse doesn't cause injuries. Witnessed by somebody else, very rare. The child needs to have told you at least 2 or 3 times, very rare. So we expect, or the person who's doing it admits it, very rare. So that would give us the beyond reasonable doubt evidence, so we're not going to get that. But actually we do have a legal framework that we should be using, it's just we don't really use it, and that's the balance of probabilities. Now, unfortunately, what happens is when the police, so if the police don't feel they can get that beyond reasonable doubt evidence, they will say, well, we can't take further action on this. Now, that would be fine if we didn't then close those cases, okay? Because as I said at the beginning or earlier, no further action in 9 out of 10 cases. So if we are not doing anything, if we're being led by that decision, then we are not protecting 9 out of 10 of those children. When a no further action decision happens, social care say, nothing we can do. The agencies that might have referred those children in, do I even mention it to this child? Do I speak to them about what's happened? Did it even happen? Worst case scenario, did this child make it up? They don't get referred to specialist services. They don't get the teacher at school saying, I'm sorry this happened to you and we still need to give you support. We don't get work with the families. And that is most of the children. So a big task for social work is using what we know about the law. That's one of the amazing things about social work is we know the law, right? And actually our law is a balance of probability, so we need to be using that all the time to protect children better. We seem to do it more with sexual abuse than any of the other sorts of harm. Is interesting, and we are hoping to make some changes in working together around making sure that this happens less. But okay. The other thing is if we've talked about, but if no verbal report is given, then people think that they can't take any action at all. Okay, so can you read that? Yeah, you can read that. So this is one of the things that we put in the report, but when we think about child sexual abuse, we always think about it as being really, really dreadful, and it is. But because we always think about it as being really, really dreadful, we think that we've got to be experts to respond to it. And actually, we all need to just be experts. What we need is everybody across the whole system knowing what they can and should say to children. Because if every professional knew when there was a child, whether or not the police had taken further action, the doctor or the school teacher or one of us could just say, you do know, at least say to this child, you don't know it's not your fault. That would be amazing. Because actually, the whole process of grooming a child is about giving the child responsibility for what's happened to them. I did this to you because you were good, you were bad, you were naughty, you were this, you were that, this is you, because you took the toy, because you took the gift, da, 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 da. This is about giving them the responsibility. And then we don't present them with a different perspective on that. We don't say, do you know what, this, whatever you're feeling, this was not your fault, this was not your responsibility. Because, we might do that if the police take further action or we refer them to services or we do something, but most children won't get any of that input. So what we need is everybody knowing what they can say and saying some of those things so that children don't have to wait 30 years to be in therapy before someone tells them, do you know, it wasn't your fault. So that we're doing that immediately. then we could prevent so much later harm. We could prevent short and long-term mental health problems. We could prevent mental health, substance misuse, the responsibility and guilt that people feel because they think they caused it themselves leads to the drug and alcohol problems, the mental health problems, the issues with parenting, all that kind of stuff, sometimes later offending. We could prevent all of that if we start responding better to children at the beginning. I am not going to go in detail through the recommendations. What was interesting is when we were thinking about the recommendations is we wanted them to, any of them, if they only took one of them, we wanted it to be something that was good and would make a difference. What was really positive is the government have accepted all of them, which is great. The detail of that, we need to do a bit of work on, but essentially they have accepted the recommendations. What was really interesting is that all the things that we were thinking needed to change, we were saying, well, we better not check it's already in guidance, because if it's already in guidance, it's a wasted recommendation, right? So then I was reading guidance, I read the whole of Working Together. It was a thrilling job. But what I was finding was that actually it's in guidance. Oh, you should talk directly to children. Oh, you should be having a meeting after the police take no further action. It's there. But it's not filtering down to practice. This is about culture, changing practice culture somehow. What it did mean is that the panel could say, actually, you don't need to wait for the government's response on these, crack on and get safeguarding partnerships to do these. So safeguarding partnerships at the moment, hopefully, are working away on how they're going to meet these recommendations. Our favourite one, we think, you sort of think, what's our favourite one, is the government must ensure that professionals, something along the lines of, can and should talk directly to children and families about concerns of sexual abuse. So now we have it in black and white in a government report. So we are pushing that out all over the place. Whenever someone says to you, anyone, well, we can't really ask them, or we can't mention it, we can't say it. Oh, yes, you can. So that feels like a good step forward. But there's some other good ones in there as well. In terms of the social work role, we can make such a difference. We are in such a great position. It's a privileged position, really. We can do such a lot of things to kind of change the outcomes. And I say children and young people, but also parents who've often experienced sexual abuse themselves. We can change so much for them just by talking about it. Every single interaction we have is an opportunity to do something good in this space, essentially. We're decision makers, aren't we? We're advocates. We believe in change. So we have the law, we learn about the law, so we can do a lot. And we can do that through our one-to-one interactions. We can do that through kind of knowing and understanding and practicing the legislation as it is meant to be. We can do it in terms of using the best evidence and applying that to what we do. We know about evidence and research, and through being brave. This requires us sometimes putting our head above the parapet and saying to the child protection chair or the judge or whoever it is, the legal department or whoever it is, kind of saying, actually, this isn't right. We have legislation that supports this, so it is about being brave. We have the skills already. You do not need any new skills to talk about child sexual abuse. These are the skills you need for talking about all of it. We have the skills. This is what we do for a living. We need to get the knowledge and confidence. So there is something about, hopefully the frontline graduates have got some of this well, but we need to be kind of sharing it with colleagues. We need to be kind of putting pressure for people to put on post-qualifying training so that we learn about this stuff. Frontline is on it, so I'm a bit preaching to the converted, but normally I'm kind of like this to people, you need to have some training on this. But yeah, we need to teach about all these things. These are the kind of key things that came up in the report. Also, we need access to resources. So I've shown you 3 of them today, and we have lots of other resources for practice. We have them around sibling sexual abuse, what to do if parents arrested for online offending. We have a funders and commissioners guide. We have a guide for managers and supervisors around supervising child sexual abuse. We have a whole series of kind of key messages from research papers, which is just gives you all of the up-to-date research because we've done the work for you in a short document on all aspects. So that's useful for kind of reports and assessments and stuff. We have a free e-learning course, but go and have a look on the website because we have loads of stuff and it's all free. I sometimes think I feel like I'm doing a bit of a sell, but actually it's all free. So I'm not trying to sell it to you, just go and help yourselves to it. So essentially, what we need is hope and we need courage. So what children, young people and adults, survivors all say is we want you to have hope. People can and do recover from their experiences with the right support, and we need to remember that and we need to work with them. With the right support, children and young people who display harmful sexual behaviour with the right intervention won't go on to develop that in adults. Adults who offend, actually there's the lowest level of recidivism for adult offending of any other crime. So there is hope in terms of change and moving forward, and we can also prevent abuse. In terms of knowledge, this is all of our responsibilities to learn and to share and make sure other people know about it and do all that sort of stuff, particularly with other agencies. So, all other agencies think we get training on child sexual abuse. So they all refer to us for it, and then they're all a bit surprised when we don't know what we're doing, and then it makes them cross. Actually, we just need to learn about it, even if we're not getting it kind of given to us. And communication. So we have the skills in terms of communication, but we need to talk when we're worried about their behaviour, when they've told us, when we know that children have got it in their past. So one of the things we do, we know lots of children in care have previously experienced sexual abuse, but they might have been placed onto neglect. We know they've experienced sexual abuse. And then they're kicking off and they're self-harming and it's all going wrong and they're going out of place, but we're all scared to mention it. For what reason? Why aren't we saying, I do know? It doesn't matter if there was a no further action decision. That really doesn't matter. It didn't happen. But we could be naming it and helping children with this. Even when we know that they're in care for child sexual abuse, we don't have any discussions with them about what happened to them or their family. So then they leave at 16, vote with their feet, haven't learned anything about risk. There are so many kind of things that we need to be talking about, Also talking with the parents, talking with each other, talking with our friends, our families. Talk. So I want to just end in this quote. Sadly, Sarah Nelson died about a month ago, but she was kind of a radical social work writer and a social work journalist, essentially. But she said, remember, there are always far more people who want to protect children than those who want to abuse them, and we should use and be heartened by the great potential in collective strength. And together, actually, we can do this. We just need to kind of do it, really. So just going to leave that up for a bit. So if anything has come up for you, you want to do a bit of a QR code, we have a Get Support page, which you can just put your postcode in and get any support you need. And I will flick back to this slide in a minute, but if any of you have got any concerns about your own or others' behaviours, there is also the Stop It Now helpline. I shall leave that one on and say that's me done.